And now, as a result of those inflamed tensions in both Israeli and Palestinian communities, people on all sides of this war are turning away from a two-state solution, including Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who in recent weeks has said out loud repeatedly what many have long suspected, by outright rejecting the idea of Palestinian statehood and sovereignty. As the highest-ranking Jewish elected official in our government, and as a staunch defender of Israel, I rise today to say unequivocally, this is a grave mistake for Israel, for Palestinians, for the region, and for the world. The only real and sustainable solution to this decades-old conflict is a negotiated two-state solution, a demilitarized Palestinian state living side by side with Israel in equal measures of peace, security, prosperity, dignity, and mutual recognition. Both Jews and Palestinians have long historic claims to this land. Contrary to the unfounded, absurd, and offensive claims by some that the Jewish people are colonizers in their ancestral homeland, Jewish people have lived in the homeland continuously for more than 3 millennia, 3,000 years. For centuries, Jews have made aliyah and gone to the land of Israel to live and settle. For centuries, at Passover, Jews at every corner of the globe have prayed next year in Jerusalem. A Jewish homeland in Israel is no 20th century contrivance. Israel's our historic home, a home for people oppressed for centuries. Now, the Palestinians, too, have lived on the land for generations, and in past centuries, they have formed their own distinct culture, identity, cuisine, literature. The idea espoused by some, quote, there is no such thing as Palestinians, unquote, is inaccurate, offensive, unhelpful. The only just solution to this predicament is one in which each people can flourish in their own state, side by side. But for a two-state solution to work over the long term, it has to include real and meaningful compromises by both sides. For example, too many Israelis who say they want a two-state solution don't acknowledge how the amount and extent of expanding settlements renders that a virtual impossibility. And too many Palestinians who say they want a two-state solution don't acknowledge how their insistence on an unequivocal right of return is a fatal impediment to progress. Both ways of thinking are impeding the peace process. And there are others on the left who view a two-state solution with skepticism as an ideal that will never happen, a far-off goal that allows for the continuation of the status quo in Gaza and the West Bank, where Palestinians face unique obstacles compared to their Israeli counterparts. As a result, they reject a two-state solution in favor of one state, where Palestinians and Israelis would supposedly live in democratic peace side by side. I can understand the idealism that inspires so many young people in particular to support a one-state solution. Why can't we all live side by side and house by house in peace? I count at least 2 reasons why this wouldn't work and why it is unacceptable to most Jewish people. First, this combined state could take an extreme turn politically, putting Jewish Israelis in peril. This state would be a majority Palestinian, and in the past, some Palestinians have voted to empower groups like Hamas, which seeks to eradicate the Jewish people. It is long-standing American policy to support democracy overseas. But in this hypothetical single state, democracy could cost Israeli Jews their safety if extremists were to take control of this new state of affairs to ultimately achieve their true aim, the violent expulsion of Jews from the Holy Land. Now, this is no abstract fear. Thousands of years of Jewish history show that when things go badly, the people of the country in which Jews live, even in a democracy, all too often turn on them as convenient scapegoats. There's no guarantee this wouldn't happen again in a single Israeli-Palestinian state. To have Palestinian voters be the protector of Israeli Jews would be a bridge too far to accept. Second, and even more important, The Jewish people have a right to their own state. It is so troubling to me that many people, especially on the left, seem to acknowledge and even celebrate this right to statehood for every group but the Jews. If a national homeland for all peoples of the world has been the driving goal of the anti-colonial movement of the last century, then why are only Jews seemingly penalized for this aspiration? Jews have a human right to their own state, just as any other people do, Palestinians included. As I have said, there are also some Israelis who oppose even a two-state solution with a demilitarized Palestinian state because they fear that it might tolerate or be a harbor for further terrorism against a Jewish state. I understand these fears, but the bitter reality is that a single state controlled by Israel, which they advocate, guarantees certain war forever and further isolation of the Jewish community in the world to the extent that its future would be jeopardized. Let me elaborate. They say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. If Israel were to not only maintain the status quo, but to go beyond that and tighten its control over Gaza and the West Bank, as some in the current Netanyahu administration have suggested, in effect creating a de facto single state, then what reasonable expectation can we have that Hamas and their allies will lay down their arms? It would mean constant war. On top of that, Israel, moving closer to a single state entirely under its control, would further rupture its relationship with the rest of the world, including the United States. Support for Israel has declined worldwide in the last few months, and this trend will only get worse if the Israeli government continues to follow its current path. I appreciate that so many Israelis cannot contemplate the possibility of two states right now because they remain so traumatized and so angry by what Hamas did on October 7th. The brutality, the viciousness, the sexual assault, the imprisonment and abuse of hundreds of hostages. I'm, of course, sympathetic to this point of view. I'm upset. I'm angry, too. We'll never forget what happened on October 7th. But even while we carry that anguish in our hearts, we have to think ahead to the future, the medium, the long term, how we can ensure that something like October 7th never happens again. We cannot let anger or trauma determine our actions or cloud our judgment. A two-state solution may feel daunting, especially now, but I believe it is the only realistic and sustainable solution on the basis of security, on the basis of prosperity, on the basis of fundamental human rights and dignity.